The tray didn't fall. That's what nobody understood later. Tilted. Just slightly. One glass shifted toward the edge, and the room held its breath. Not because anyone cared about the glass. Not because anyone cared about the waiter holding it. They held their breath because of who was sitting at that table. Zephyr Caldwell didn't move. His hand was already raised, reaching for the glass his server was bringing, and then everything just stopped. Not dramatically, not with a gasp or a crash. It just stopped, like a frame frozen mid-film. The waiter steadied the tray, set the glass down, stepped back. Nobody clapped. Nobody exhaled. The conversation at the surrounding tables resumed within seconds, because in the Idiwan district you didn't make noise about minor things. You especially didn't make noise when the Caldwell triplets were in the room. The Caldwell brothers, Zephyr, Desmond, and Rain, occupied the center table of Aurelius, the kind of restaurant where the wine list was longer than most people's lease agreements. The kind of place where the lighting was designed to make everyone look important and the silence between courses felt intentional. Zephyr sat at the head of the arrangement. He always did. Not by command. Just by gravity. He was the kind of man rooms rearranged themselves around. 6'3", dark-suited, jaw like carved stone. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't have to. When Zephyr Caldwell said something, the walls leaned in. Desmond sat to his left. Quieter. Watchful. The one people always forgot to watch, which was exactly why he was the most dangerous. He had the kind of stillness that wasn't peace. It was calculation. Rain sat across from them both. Youngest by 4 minutes. Sharp-tongued, sharp-eyed, and currently the only one at the table pretending to read the menu. None of them were here for the food. Hi, viewers. If someone you thought was gone from your life suddenly appeared right in front of you, would you say something? Or would you wait and watch first? Drop your answer in the comments. The waiter moved through the room like he was trying to disappear into it. His name tag read Ezra. That was all anyone needed to know in a place like this. First name. No last name. Just a function walking between tables. He was young. Couldn't be more than mid-20s. And he was very clearly, visibly pregnant, the kind of pregnant that made the apron strings strain and the shirt buttons work overtime. He carried his tray with both hands wrapped tight around the edges, adjusting his posture every few steps to compensate for the shift in his center of gravity. He didn't complain, didn't slow down, didn't ask for anything. He worked like a person who understood that asking for things had a cost. The other staff moved around him with a specific kind of practice distance. Not meanness. Not quite. More like an agreed-upon silence. The kind of silence that says, we don't see this, and you don't see us not seeing it. At table 9, a woman in a red blazer whispered something to her companion. Her companion glanced at Ezra, then at the Caldwell table, then back at her water glass. That was the whole conversation. That was all it needed to be. Because in the Idiwan district, silence was a language. And tonight it was saying a lot. Ezra reached the Caldwell table on his second rotation. He placed the appetizer plates without making eye contact, reached across to adjust a fork, and then straightened up to leave. That's when it happened. Not the tray moment. That had already passed. This was something else. Zephyr's glass never reached his lips. He had picked it up, lifted it halfway, and then his hand just held there, motionless. His eyes tracked Ezra's back as the waiter moved away. Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically, not visibly to the whole room, but Desmond caught it. Desmond always caught things. He looked at his brother. Zephyr said nothing. He set the glass down slowly. Rain lowered the menu. The three of them sat in a quiet that had texture to it now. Something had changed in the air at that table, and none of them said a word about it. Because the Caldwell brothers did not react in public. They processed. They filed. They acted later, carefully, quietly, and completely. But something was already moving behind Zephyr's eyes. He didn't react like a man who had seen a stranger. He reacted like a man who had just seen something he thought he'd never see again. The glass stayed on the table untouched, for the rest of the meal. And across the room, Ezra moved between tables with his tray balanced and his eyes down, completely unaware that the past had just walked back into his life wearing a $1,000 suit. By 10 the next morning, there was already a file. Not a thick one. Not yet. Just a name, a restaurant, a shift schedule, and 3 photographs taken without flash. That was how Desmond worked. Quiet entry. No drama. Just the first layer pulled back to see what was underneath. The photographs were ordinary. Ezra leaving through the service exit. Ezra crossing the employee parking area. Ezra standing at a bus stop, one hand braced on the metal pole, the other pressed flat against the side of his stomach. Desmond placed them on the table in front of Zephyr without comment. Zephyr looked at them for a long time. Then, employment record? Desmond was already shaking his head. Nothing registered. The restaurant pays him in cash. No tax file. No direct deposit. No W-2. No record of him at that location or any other, in any formal employment database. Rain leaned forward. How is he on staff if there's no file? He's not on staff. Not officially. The room held that for a moment. Off the books. Fully pregnant. Carrying trays in a high-end restaurant 6 nights a week. No documentation. No protection. No trace. This matters. Pay attention to that word, no trace. Because that's not poverty. That's not just desperation. A person can be desperate and still leave a paper trail. A person can be struggling and still show up in a system somewhere. A clinic, a shelter, a county record. Ezra didn't show up anywhere. That's not an accident. Later that afternoon, Desmond made a quiet call to the restaurant's general manager. A heavy-set man named Clifton Price, who had been running the front of house at Aurelius for 11 years. The call was framed as routine. A standard compliance inquiry. Nothing threatening. Clifton's voice changed the moment the questions shifted toward Ezra. Not dramatically. Not with obvious alarm. But his answers got shorter. His pauses got longer. He said things like, "Our staffing arrangements are internal," and "I'm not sure who you're referring to," which was remarkable, because Ezra had been working that floor for at least 4 months. Desmond thanked him politely and ended the call. He wrote one note. Price knows exactly who he is, and Price is afraid of something. Zephyr read the note twice. That afternoon, he drove past the restaurant himself, parked across the street. Not to confront anyone. Not yet. Just to watch. He stayed 40 minutes. Long enough to see Ezra arrive for his shift through the side entrance, moving carefully, one hand steadying himself against the wall as he navigated the step up into the service corridor. Long enough to see the door close behind him. Long enough to understand that Ezra had been here, right here in this city, in this district, while the world around him had apparently agreed to act like he didn't exist. This is how people disappear. Not with violence. Not always. Sometimes it's quieter than that. A name removed from a list. A file never created. A pregnancy with no medical registration, which was, Desmond had confirmed, the case. There was no prenatal record for Ezra anywhere in the city's healthcare network. No OB assignment. No hospital intake. No clinic visit logged. A pregnancy that, on paper, wasn't happening. To a person who, on paper, wasn't there. Rain pulled the thread further. Cross-referencing names, looking for any record older than 4 months. And he found one. Small. Buried. A single entry in a private placement registry from nearly 3 years ago. The name attached to it was not Ezra's full name. It was a shortened version. A nickname form. The kind of name you'd use if you wanted someone to be findable, but only by the right people. Only if you already knew where to look. Someone had done this carefully. Someone had structured the disappearance with enough detail that it almost held. Almost. Because buried under the missing records, the cash payments, and the sealed clinic files, was a name that shouldn't exist anymore. And it did. The fire started on a Tuesday. That's the detail that stays. Not the size of it. Not the damage. Just that it was a Tuesday mid-afternoon, when most of the other kids were still in the common room. And by the time the smoke reached the hallway, Ezra was already at the window. He was 9 years old. He doesn't talk about that day. He hasn't talked about it to anyone in a very long time. But it lives in the body the way certain things do, in the specific way he angles himself toward exit doors when he enters a room, in the way he counts windows, in the way his breathing changes when he smells anything that reminds him of heat and closed spaces and the sound of glass cracking in its frame. The group home burned on a Tuesday. His parents were already gone by then. His mother first, then his father, 2 years apart, both quietly, both in circumstances that no one investigated with any urgency. Ezra had been in the system since he was 5. He had learned early that the system was not designed to find things. It was designed to process them. He processed. He survived the fire. He was moved to a different facility. Then another. Then, at 15, he was placed with a private care contractor, a company called Meridian Youth Services, which sounded institutional and clean and responsible. It was none of those things. At Meridian, the kids worked. Not officially. Not logged. Kitchen shifts, cleaning rotations, small errands that required being invisible. Ezra was good at being invisible by then. He had practiced. He did what was asked. He didn't push back because pushing back had consequences he had seen other kids absorb and survive and then go quiet about forever. At 18, he aged out. That should have been a door opening. It wasn't. Because what Ezra didn't know, what he wouldn't understand for years, was that Meridian Youth Services had been using the minors in their care as undocumented labor for a network of private businesses. The contractor had an arrangement. The businesses got workers. Meridian got paid. The kids got nothing that could be proven in court. And when those kids turned 18 and tried to establish themselves, tried to get IDs, employment records, medical histories, they hit walls. Walls that had been quietly built while they weren't watching. Ezra's legal identity had gaps in it. Not obvious ones. Not the kind a casual check would catch. But the kind that made formal employment complicated. The kind that made certain records inaccessible. The kind that made a person easy to keep informal. Easy to keep off the books. The pregnancy wasn't an accident either. He knew who the father was. He had known since the beginning. But knowing didn't mean anything in a world where his identity had been structurally undermined, where the people who were supposed to protect him had instead traded him like a line item, where the documentation that would have given him leverage was either missing or sealed or simply never created. The pregnancy was the one thing that was real and undeniable. And that is exactly what made it dangerous to the people who needed him invisible. Because a pregnancy creates a record. A birth requires documentation. A child needs a legal parent. And a legal parent needs an identity that holds up. Someone had noticed that problem before Ezra did. Someone had already started making calls. The fire wasn't an accident. That's the part Desmond found last. Buried in an insurance document from 13 years ago. Payout. Fast one. Processed within 60 days of the fire at the group home. The recipient wasn't the county facility. It wasn't a state agency. It was a private foundation. A foundation with the same routing address as the company that would later become Meridian Youth Services. The fire wasn't the start of something. It was the middle. And the people who had claimed to rescue Ezra afterward. The ones who moved him, placed him, processed him through their system, were the same people who had made sure that no one would ever think to look for him. Zephyr went back to the restaurant 3 more times that week. He never went inside. He didn't need to. He sat in the back of a black car on the opposite side of the street, and he watched. Not obsessively. Precisely. There's a difference. He was watching for patterns, the kind that tell you more than a conversation would. Who arrived first? Who left last? Who controlled the rhythm of the floor? Ezra arrived early every shift. 40 minutes before his call time. He came through the side entrance, not the main one. He wore the same black apron every day. The restaurant didn't issue him a spare. He worked straight through without a break that Zephyr could see. And he left the same way he came in. Side exit. Quiet. No conversation with the other staff in the parking area. Just the long walk to the bus stop alone. This matters, because in a normal workplace, even a high-pressure one, people cluster after a shift. They debrief. They complain. They share a few words at the very minimum. It's human. It's automatic. Ezra didn't do any of that. Not because he was unfriendly. Zephyr had watched long enough to see that. The Omega had a careful politeness. He held doors. He nodded at the dishwasher who passed him in the corridor. He once stopped to pick up something a server had dropped without being asked. He just wasn't included. And nobody on that staff was going to explain why. By Thursday, Zephyr brought in two people, Marcus Deal and a woman who went by Sasha, both of whom had been running private investigations for the Caldwell organization for 4 years. They were not loud people. They did not drive obvious vehicles or ask pointed questions. They moved through the world the way information moved, quietly, through systems, in ways that didn't leave a visible mark. Within 48 hours, the picture they brought back was worse than Zephyr expected. Ezra had no formal employment contract with Aurelius. The restaurant had him listed under a miscellaneous staffing category that was typically used for one-night event workers. He had been in that category for 4 months, well beyond the legal window for that classification. His pay was structured to avoid thresholds that would trigger mandatory documentation. His medical situation was more concerning. There had been no prenatal visit on record. Not at the hospital network. Not at any clinic in the district. Sasha found one reference, a single appointment notation in a private OB practice in the Eastern District, that had been manually removed from the digital record. Not deleted. Removed. The notation still existed in the backup log, which the practice hadn't thought to also clean. Someone with access to that system had erased the visit. Not someone low-level. Someone with credentials. The identity suppression was even more deliberate. Ezra's formal documentation had specific gaps that Marcus flagged immediately. Gaps that a trained eye recognized as intentional. Not the kind of gaps that happen when someone falls through the cracks. The kind of gaps that happen when someone is guided toward the cracks. Nudged there. Structured into a position where official channels would reject him without explanation. Marcus put it plainly in his report. This individual has been maintained in an unregistered labor capacity through systematic document interference. The pregnancy has not been clinically managed, which appears connected to the suppression of his medical registration. This is not individual negligence. This is coordinated management. Coordinated management. Power doesn't always attack directly. Sometimes it just builds the walls quietly, steps back, and waits for the person inside to exhaust themselves trying to find the door. Ezra wasn't trapped by chance. He was being held in place. And whoever held him in place had been doing it long enough to be comfortable. Long enough to stop watching the exits as carefully. Rain made one more connection that afternoon. The cash distribution from Aurelius had a routing pattern. It cycled through 2 shell accounts before landing in a payroll reserve that was technically owned by a hospitality holding group. That group had 17 properties. Cross-referencing staff records at those properties or the absence of them revealed a pattern. At least 11 current employees across those 17 properties had the same documentation profile as Ezra. Same gap structure. Same cash arrangement. Same absence from the medical registry. 11 people. And those were just the ones they could confirm. The Omega wasn't just hidden. He was contained within a system that knew exactly what it was doing. And someone very powerful had signed off on every layer of it. The network had a name. It took Desmond 3 days to find it. 3 days of cross-referencing business registrations, holding company trees, and the kind of financial architecture that was designed specifically to resist being read. But at the center of it all, once you stripped away the layers, was a name. The Orantia Group. On paper, Orantia was a healthcare and hospitality investment firm. They held stakes in 5 private hospital systems, 2 outpatient clinic networks, a mid-size hotel chain, and a constellation of upscale restaurants, including Aurelius. They had a corporate philanthropy arm. They issued sustainability reports. They had a headquarters with a glass facade in the financial district and a website that loaded cleanly and said all the right things. None of it was clean. Desmond laid the structure out across 3 screens in the Triplet's private office. He spoke without theatrics, just the sequence, just the facts, just the architecture of what had been built and how long it had been running. The hospital side was the core. Orantia controlled the data flow through their clinic network. They had the ability, and based on what Marcus and Sasha had recovered, the proven practice of suppressing medical registrations for individuals who had been flagged by their labor arm. Not reclassifying them, moving them into archive structures that required specific clearance levels to access. The individuals themselves would never know. They would show up at a clinic, be told their insurance wasn't recognized, be directed elsewhere, be redirected again until they stopped trying. The labor side ran parallel. Through the hospitality group, Orantia maintained an informal workforce drawn from 2 sources. Adults aging out of the private care system, some of which Orantia subsidiaries had operated, and Omegas who had arrived in the city through relocation assistance programs that Orantia had also partially funded. It wasn't trafficking in the obvious sense. Nothing that loud. Nothing that crude. It was structured dependency. They moved people into positions where the only support available came through them. Housing stipends tied to employment. Employment tied to documentation they controlled. Documentation processed through systems they owned. Every thread led back to the same group of investors. The pregnancy registry was the piece that stunned even Rain. Across the Orantia-linked clinic network, there was a secondary registration system, not the official one, not the state-mandated one. A shadow registry. It logged pregnancies among their informal workforce and tagged them with status codes. The codes determined whether a pregnancy would be quietly transferred to the formal system or kept in the shadow one. Pregnancies in the shadow system received no prenatal care through official channels. They received no legal registration. The children born through that system, and there were records going back 9 years, were processed through a private birth certification pathway that left them with documentation gaps almost identical to the ones their parents had been living with. The cycle was the design. Rain sat back from the screens. This isn't one restaurant. This isn't one manager cutting corners. Desmond shook his head. This is infrastructure. Zephyr stood at the window facing the city. He hadn't spoken in 15 minutes. His arms were crossed. His jaw was set. He was doing that thing he did when something required more than a decision, when it required a reckoning. He turned around. Ezra doesn't know any of this. No, Desmond said. He knows he's being managed. He doesn't know the architecture. Does he know he's in the registry? He wouldn't. The shadow registry isn't accessible to the people in it. Zephyr nodded slowly. This was the moment. Not a loud one. Not a dramatic one. Just a man standing in a room looking at the shape of something that was much larger than he had been prepared for, and deciding quietly what he was going to do about it. This wasn't just about Ezra. That's what nobody had said out loud yet, but all 3 of them felt it. Ezra was one name, one documentation file, one shadow registration, but across 17 properties, across a decade of operation, across a clinic network that touched 4 districts of this city. There were hundreds. Maybe more. And if Zephyr pulled this one thread, Ezra's thread, carefully enough with the right people positioned at the right pressure points, the entire structure would have nowhere left to stand. He looked at his brothers. We need to be at the gala. Neither of them asked which one. They already knew. Because this wasn't survival anymore. This was strategy. And somewhere across the city, in a narrow apartment with the curtains drawn against the evening light, Ezra sat with one hand pressed to his stomach and the other wrapped around a cold cup of tea, completely unaware that 3 decisions had just been made on his behalf. Decisions that would change everything. Starting with the people who thought they had built walls high enough to last. They hadn't built them high enough. Not even close. He saw the car. Not the first time it appeared. The second. Ezra wasn't the kind of person who noticed things dramatically. He didn't freeze up, didn't spin around, didn't let his eyes linger. He had learned years ago that reacting to surveillance, even justified surveillance, gave the watcher information. So he registered the car the way he registered everything. Quietly, internally, filed away without visible response. Black, parked across the street. Same spot as 3 nights ago. Different plate, but same model. He kept walking to the bus stop. He sat down. He adjusted the weight of the bag on his shoulder. He watched the road. The car didn't move, and Ezra didn't move toward it. That was the thing about him. That was the thing nobody at Aurelius had figured out, and that Clifton Price had never quite understood despite 4 months of having Ezra on his floor. He was not passive. He was not broken. He was not the kind of person who had given up on understanding what was happening around him. He had simply learned the cost of reacting before you knew the full picture. So he waited. He watched. He filed things away. 3 days ago, he had noticed that the other staff had started clearing out of certain rooms before he entered them. Not every room, just the ones where Price had meetings. The stockroom, the back office. It was a small change in behavior, the kind of change that meant someone had given an instruction. Someone had said, "Keep distance." 2 days ago, Layla, one of the other servers, the one who sometimes gave him a quiet nod when they passed in the hall, had stopped nodding. Not rudely, she just looked away, like she'd been told to. Yesterday, the prep cook who had always let Ezra take his break near the kitchen door had started locking that door between shifts. Distance, quiet, managed separation. Someone had tightened the walls. Ezra pressed one hand flat against his stomach. The baby moved. A small, rolling pressure just below his ribs. He let out a slow breath. He had thought about leaving. He had thought about it more than once. Moving districts. Finding a different floor job, a different arrangement. But the problem with leaving was that the arrangement he had, cash, no documentation, no questions, was exactly the kind of arrangement that followed you when your paperwork had holes in it. You didn't escape it by geography. You just found a new version of the same room. And the baby needed to be born somewhere. In a facility. With records. With a name attached. That was the thing nobody in Price's operation had fully worked out yet. They could suppress Ezra's medical registration indefinitely, but eventually, a birth created documentation. A child needed a birth certificate. A birth certificate named a parent. A named parent needed an identity that held. Ezra had been thinking about that for weeks. He was already building the next move. Slowly, carefully, with whatever limited pieces he had available. He didn't need saving. He understood that better than anyone. What makes a person strong isn't loudness. It's the ability to endure the long middle, the part where nothing looks like it's changing, and still keep thinking. Still keep planning. Still refuse to hand over the last thing nobody has managed to take yet. Which was his mind. His clarity. His patience. The bus arrived. He stood, boarded, found a seat near the window. The black car did not follow. He noted that too. Whoever was watching him wasn't moving against him. Not yet. But this time, and this was the shift, this was the change in the air he had been feeling for days. Survival wasn't going to be enough. Something was coming. He could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives, not seeing the storm yet, but sensing the drop in pressure. The stillness before the air changes. He didn't know who was in that car. He didn't know what they had already found. But he knew. With the specific certainty of someone who had learned to read silence as a language, that whatever was coming next was going to require more than endurance. Then Zephyr stopped coming. Just like that. No note. No signal. No final pass in the black car. One day the surveillance was active and then it simply wasn't. The parking spot across the street sat empty 3 nights in a row. Marcus and Sasha went quiet. No updates. No check-ins. Nothing that Desmond pushed to Zephyr's phone for 11 days. 11 days. Ezra noticed on day 3. He didn't react to that either, not visibly. But he noticed. And the noticing cost him something. Not hope. He was too careful for hope. But there had been a small, involuntary calculation running in the back of his mind. something that said, "Someone is paying attention, which means someone might act, which means the shape of this situation might be changing." That calculation went quiet on day 3. And the silence that replaced it was a particular kind of silence. The kind that made Price bolder. The shift change on day 4 started at 5:30 instead of 6. Ezra arrived to find his station had been reassigned to the main floor, the high-traffic section, the one that required the most physical movement, the most lifting, the most back and forth between the kitchen and the far tables. No explanation. Just a new assignment sheet taped to the back office door. He worked it. Day 6, the shifts went to 9 hours without adjustment to pay. Day 8, he asked Price about it. Price didn't look at him when he answered. "Staffing's tight. Everyone's carrying more right now." That was all. Ezra went back to the floor. His back was worse by the end of that week. Not dangerously, not yet. But the kind of persistent ache that settles in when the body is being asked for more than it can properly give. He moved through it. He did the shifts. He counted the cash at the end of each night and put it in the envelope he kept inside his mattress, because he didn't have a bank account that he trusted, and because cash in hand was at least cash he controlled. He was down to $14 outside the envelope. The baby was now past 7 months. Let that sit for a moment. 7 months pregnant. 9-hour shifts. No prenatal care logged anywhere in the official system. No registered midwife. No hospital intake. Living on cash and the understanding that if he made noise, the arrangement he had, imperfect as it was, would collapse. And he had nowhere else to go. Meanwhile, in a different part of the city, Zephyr wasn't absent. He was preparing. The 11 days of silence were not withdrawal. They were the opposite. Rain had spent that time building a legal framework, working with 2 attorneys who specialized in labor exploitation cases and 1 federal contact who had been circling the Orantia Group's financial structure for over a year without enough leverage to move. Now there was leverage. The shadow pregnancy registry. The insurance document tied to the group home fire. The 11 matching documentation profiles across 17 properties. The manually deleted clinic record. The shell account structure. All of it compiled, cross-referenced, and presented in a format that could survive scrutiny. The federal contact looked at the file and didn't speak for almost a full minute. Then she said, "We need a public moment, not a private arrest, not a quiet settlement. A public moment, the kind that collapses the spin before the spin can start. The kind that makes it impossible for lawyers to contain the story because the story is already everywhere." Rain knew exactly where to find one. The Orantia Group's annual gala was 12 days away. Ivory Hall, Idiwan District, 700 guests. Media access granted to 4 outlets. Live-streamed portion for investors in the first 40 minutes. And on the working staff list for the event, Ezra's name, assigned by Price, without asking. Without considering what it would cost someone 7 months pregnant to work a 4-hour gala event on their feet in a formal service capacity. Without considering, or perhaps calculating, that by that point the walls they had built around Ezra would be close enough to finish that one more shift wouldn't matter. They had miscalculated. Because somewhere in the city decisions were already being made. Quiet ones. Final ones. The kind that don't announce themselves until the moment they become impossible to stop. The invitation said, "An evening of vision." 700 guests in a space designed to make power look effortless. Ivory Hall had been built for exactly this, the kind of event where the lighting was warm enough to be flattering but cool enough to stay serious. Where the flower arrangements cost more than most people's monthly rent. Where the servers wore white gloves and moved through the crowd like they were part of the architecture. Ezra arrived at 4:15. Setup crew. First wave. He was assigned to the East Ballroom. The larger of the 2 spaces, the one where the formal remarks would happen, where the investors would sit during the livestream portion. He carried a tray of empty champagne flutes from the service corridor to the bar station and set them in 2 careful rows without stopping to breathe between trips. His back was tight from the moment he arrived. He didn't stop. Around him, the other staff moved with the choreographed efficiency of an event this size. Everyone had a role, everyone had a section. Nobody had time for anything outside their assigned radius. Ezra worked his station quietly. He knew the layout. He knew the timing. He had worked large events before, and the muscle memory was there even when the body protested. By 6, the guests were arriving. Politicians first, the kind who arrive early to be seen arriving. Then the investors, in clusters, with the specific ease of people who had never waited for anything. Then the media section filled in, 3 cameras positioned near the stage, 1 roving. And then, towards 6:30, the Orantia executives. Ezra saw Clifton Price near the east entrance, talking to a man in a gray suit he didn't recognize. Price glanced across the room once, found Ezra, tracked him for 2 seconds, looked away. That was it. That was the check. Still here. Still working. Still contained. Ezra turned back to his station. He didn't see the 3 men who arrived at 6:45. Not at first. They came in through the north entrance, the guests of honor corridor, with the kind of quiet that drew eyes without demanding them. No announcement. No flourish. Zephyr, Desmond, and Rain Caldwell moved through the room the way they always moved through a room, like they had already decided how it was going to end. Rain found his position near the media access point. Desmond moved toward the investor section. Zephyr stood at the edge of the room and looked at the stage. The most dangerous moments aren't chaotic. They're the ones that look completely ordinary right up until they don't. The formal program began at 7. An Orantia executive, a man named Garrett Ashby, smooth-voiced and practiced, stepped to the podium to open the evening with a remarks segment that would be captured on the live stream. He thanked the investors. He praised the staff. He talked about vision, about systems, about the power of infrastructure built to last. He was still talking when the screens changed. Not all at once. One at a time, starting with the screen behind the stage. The presentation slide that Ashby's team had loaded, a graphic showing Orantia's 5-year growth, disappeared. What replaced it was a document, a financial record, clean, clearly formatted, dated. Then the second screen changed. Contract. 3 pages. The relevant section highlighted. Then the third. A registry. Names, status codes, dates. The shadow system, laid out in full. Ashby stopped mid-sentence. The room didn't gasp. Not immediately. 700 people processing information at different speeds. First the ones closest to the screens, then the ripple outward. The media cameras were already pivoting. The roving camera operator had stopped moving and was holding position, pointed directly at the main screen. The federal contact. A woman named Adrienne Voss, who had walked in quietly at 6:55 and positioned herself near the east exit, made 1 phone call. 12 seconds. She ended the call and put her phone in her pocket. 3 minutes later, the first set of quiet arrivals came through the service entrance. Not dramatic. No shouting. No running. Just the specific, controlled efficiency of people who had already reviewed the building layout and knew exactly where each person of interest was standing. Price was the first one they reached. He went pale before anyone touched him. And in the middle of the East Ballroom, with screens still displaying everything that had been designed never to be seen, Ezra stood at his station, tray in hand, completely still. He didn't understand all of it yet, but he understood enough to know that the walls he had spent years learning to navigate had just stopped standing. Nobody ran. That was the part people talked about afterward. 700 guests, 12 screens, a stage full of executives who had just watched their entire private operation become public property, and nobody ran. They just stood there, processing, calculating, trying to determine in real time whether this was something they could still manage. It wasn't. Garrett Ashby stepped back from the podium. Not dramatically, just back, and said something to the woman beside him that nobody near enough to hear repeated later. His face was the specific color of someone who had prepared for many outcomes and was now standing in the one they had not prepared for. The live stream was still running. That was the detail that mattered most. Rain had made sure of it. The technical team managing the feed hadn't been touched, hadn't been warned, so when the screens changed, the stream changed with them. 40 seconds of financial records. 60 seconds of the contract. 90 seconds of the registry, with the status codes visible and the dates clear. 43,000 people watching from outside the building saw everything before the feed was cut. By then it didn't matter. Screenshots existed. Downloads had been made. The information had the specific velocity of something that cannot be recalled once released. It moves too fast, lands in too many places, belongs to no one source and therefore cannot be contained by any one takedown. The arrests happened quietly. That's important. Not aggressively, not with the kind of visible force that gives subjects grounds to complain about procedure. Just 2 agents per person, clear identification, clear statement of reason, and a walk toward the exit that was over before most of the room registered it was happening. Ashby. 2 senior Orantia directors. The administrator who had managed the shadow registry. A clinic director from the East District Network. Price. 6 people walked out of Ivory Hall that night in custody. 17 more would follow over the next 72 hours as warrants processed. The federal case against the Orantia group, the one Adrian Voss had been building for 14 months without enough leverage, had just received everything it needed in a single evening. Documents, live witnesses, a public record that predated any spin campaign, infrastructure exposed, not with noise, not with a speech or a confrontation or a moment designed for drama. Just information placed where it couldn't be hidden. Real power doesn't fall loudly. It just stops being able to hold. Zephyr stood at the edge of the East Ballroom and watched all of it without moving. He wasn't watching Ashby. He wasn't watching the agents. He wasn't watching the screens. He was watching Ezra, who was still at his station. Tray lowered now, both hands at his sides. The room was shifting around him in ways he hadn't been given context for. People moving, voices rising in the specific frequency of controlled chaos. And he was standing in the middle of it with an expression that was very still and very careful and completely unreadable to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. But Zephyr knew. That was the look of someone who had spent years learning not to react until they understood the full picture. The full picture was still assembling itself. Desmond appeared at Zephyr's shoulder. Voss's team has the registry. All of it. They're moving on the clinic chain tonight. Zephyr nodded. The others. He meant the 11. The other workers across the 17 properties. Each location is being approached. Simultaneously. Voss didn't want a warning window. Zephyr nodded again. Across the room, a woman from the media section was moving toward Ezra with a microphone extended. Zephyr was already walking. He crossed the ballroom at a pace that wasn't urgent but covered ground quickly. And he reached Ezra before the journalist did. He stepped into the space between them without confrontation, just presence, and the journalist read the room and redirected. Ezra looked up. He hadn't seen Zephyr coming. Now he did. And for the first time in a very long time, something in his expression shifted. Not relief, not anger, not the collapse of composure he had been holding together for months. Just recognition, the specific, complicated kind. The kind that contains everything that has ever happened between 2 people and doesn't resolve any of it. Just acknowledges that both of them are still here. Zephyr didn't speak right away. He just stood there, in the middle of a room where everything was falling apart at exactly the right speed, and looked at the person he had spent 11 days preparing to find again. In the middle of it all, for the first time in years, Ezra was finally seen. The folder was brown. Nothing on the cover. No label, no seal, no indication of what it contained. Zephyr held it with both hands, not extended yet, just held, and looked at Ezra the way you look at someone when you have something to say that doesn't fit into any sentence you've rehearsed. They were in a side room off the East Ballroom, 30 feet from where 6 people had just been walked out of their own event. The sounds of the room were muffled through the wall. Voices, movement, the low register of something significant still processing itself into a new shape. Ezra stood near the window. He had set the tray down somewhere. He didn't remember exactly when. His hands were at his sides, one of them resting against his stomach the way it always did now. Not performatively, just instinctively. The weight of the baby had its own gravity. He looked at the folder, then at Zephyr. "What is that?" Zephyr set it on the small table between them. He didn't push it forward, just placed it. "Your legal identity. Fully restored. A correction filing has been submitted to the Federal Registry. It'll be processed within 10 business days. But the supporting documentation is already in place. No gaps. No flags. A pause. It's complete." Ezra didn't move toward it. "The medical piece," Zephyr continued. "There's a prenatal intake appointment registered at Meridian General for Friday morning. Private room. Dr. Camille Osei is the attending. She's been briefed on the situation. She knows the timeline. She's not going to ask questions that require an explanation you shouldn't have to give." Still Ezra didn't move. Zephyr reached into his jacket pocket, placed a second document on top of the folder. Thinner. 2 pages. "That's an ownership stake. 7% of the restructured hospitality group that will form once Orantia's assets are distributed through the federal process. It's not symbolic. It generates real quarterly income. It's in your name, your full legal name, and it cannot be accessed, altered, or removed by any other party." Ezra looked at the documents. He looked at them for a long time. His jaw was set. His eyes were clear. There was no collapse, no sudden release of everything he had been holding. That's not how it works for people who have been holding things for years. You don't just put it down. You stand with it a little longer, even after the reason for carrying it is gone, because your hands have forgotten what empty feels like. "Why?" Ezra said, not asking why any of it had happened, not asking about the past. He had a specific question and it came out in one word. Zephyr understood it. "Because what was taken from you had a shape." He didn't look away. "And I knew what the shape was." Ezra said nothing. "This isn't rescue," Zephyr said. "I need you to understand that. Rescue implies you couldn't have gotten here without someone pulling you out. That's not what this is." He gestured at the folder. "That's return. That's what was yours. Put back where it belongs." The room held that. Outside, through the wall, the sound of movement, voices wrapping up, the specific quiet of something large coming to a close. Ezra exhaled. Slow. Measured. The kind of breath that isn't relief, it's just the body finally being allowed to stop bracing. He reached out and picked up the folder. He didn't open it immediately, just held it. And in that holding, in the weight of 2 pages of documentation and 1 ownership stake and 1 appointment at a hospital that wouldn't turn him away, something shifted. Not dramatically, not with visible emotion that played for the room. Just a shift. The kind that happens when a person who has been surviving inside a structure built to contain them realizes, for the first time in a very long time, that the structure is gone. And the ground beneath them is still there. Real justice doesn't arrive with fanfare. It doesn't hand you a speech or ask you to perform gratitude. It doesn't require you to be broken enough to deserve it or strong enough to have earned it alone. It just gives back what was taken. Quietly. Completely. Without conditions. Zephyr looked at Ezra one more time. Not with the weight of everything unsaid. Not with the pull of history or the complications still ahead. Just a look that acknowledged both of them where they were and what had just changed. Then he stepped back. The appointments confirmed for Friday. Ezra nodded. He pressed the folder against his chest. His other hand rested on his stomach. The baby moved, that same rolling, certain pressure just below the ribs. And for the first time in years. Not in spite of everything, but through it, his life wasn't being controlled anymore. It was being returned. 1 document at a time. 1 name restored. 1 future finally his. If the story moved you, if you saw something in Ezra's quiet endurance that reminded you of your own strength, or someone you know, drop a comment below. Tell us what part stayed with you. Your words matter here, and they might be exactly what someone else needed to read today. And if you're new here, This channel exists for stories like this one. Stories about people who held on when everything around them was designed to make them let go. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Every story on this channel is a chance to be reminded of what people are actually capable of. Share this one. Someone in your life needs to hear it. We'll see you in the next story.